Um, Second question, how do you go about navigating through the different versions of Agadot, the different Girsaot? One of the things we notice when we read your book is that context matters in these different versions, especially between Bavli and Yerushalmi, and that they can actually inform one another rather than just being disjointed Girsaot. If you can elaborate on that, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So this, again, is one of the real advantages, I would say, in fact, to understanding Talmudic stories as literature and as didactic fiction and not as history and biography, because if you understand them as history or biography, you're taking these different versions that might contradict each other, and you're trying to harmonize them and figure out what actually happened. And inevitably, you might consider one of them as right, historically accurate, biographically true, and one is wrong, as corrupted. A witness reported things differently. But when you're looking at them as literature, you can understand them as different versions of a story told by different storytellers, trying to communicate different lessons or grapple with different problems or addressing what was most pressing in his community, in his synagogue, that might be different from that of another one. So the first thing you want to do is try to understand each story independently on its own terms, because each story is a integrated whole. I mean, each story in and of itself gives you some message or was told by a storyteller for a certain purpose. So let's say you have a story that appears in one version in the Babylonian Talmud and one version in the Jerusalem Talmud. So you would start by looking at each story itself and just asking the question, what is this story about? What is the story of the Jerusalem Talmud trying to tell us? And then what is the story in the Babylonian Talmud about? What is that trying to tell us? At that point, then the fact that they are about the same event, or that are multiple different versions of the fundamentally one story, invites you to compare and contrast them to try to understand the different interests of the storytellers. And that's where it's actually useful to have a second version, because if you just have one version, it's sometimes hard to figure out exactly what the story is about. When you have another version and you see, it's very clear that the story in the Yerushalmi focuses on this theme, whereas the story in the Bavli focuses on a different theme, and that theme from the Yerushalmi has become a minor element, then you feel you're on much safer ground as having identified which story is about, because you have an alternative version which runs differently, and you can identify and compare the other version with. So at that point, after you've got to your understanding of which each story independently is about, you want to compare and contrast and see what becomes different. And then you try to ask yourself, why did each storyteller focus on a different thing, even if it's very subtle? Can you understand why the storyteller of the Yerushalmi was interested in X and that in the Bavli more interested in Y? So sometimes, as you mentioned, this might have to do with the context. That is, often the stories appear in different contexts in the two Talmuds. Sometimes they appear in roughly the same context, the same chapter of the same tractate. But more often than that, they appear in very different contexts. It might occur in one tractate in the Bavli and a different tractate in the Yerushalmi. And it seems that, again, different storytellers have focused on these different elements or different themes, and the Talmudic redactors have understood that and used that story to relate to a certain legal issue or a certain even ethical issue that comes up in a certain tractate. And then the storytellers in the Bavli might have changed that story to focus on a different theme, and that's why it's in a different tractate in the Babylonian Talmud. So looking at context will also often help you understand what that story is about, what themes are most important in each version. But there are many other factors that might come into play. One factor is certainly the ambient culture. So in Babylonia, they were in part of the Sasanian Persian Empire. The main religion around them, or the dominant religion, was Zoroastrianism. They were dealing with certain ethnic groups, Babylonians, Persians, Mandaeans, the others. And that posed certain challenges for the rabbis in Babylonia, as opposed to in the land of Israel, which part of the Roman world at that time. They were dealing with Greco-Roman culture. They were dealing with a very strong Roman Empire, and that posed certain challenges to them. So part of the reasons you might have different emphases has to do with just the surrounding culture. And then we also do know that that the rabbinic, just the rabbinic culture of Babylonia and the land of Israel, even the culture of the different schools, the Batei Midrash, the rabbi schools, or the yeshivot, we're a little different in Bavel, in Babylonia, and in the land of Israel. That sometimes results in, again, them grappling with different problems. It's also possible that different centuries, it's very hard to date these stories. That's one of the reasons why it's hard to write biography and history on their basis. But the 3rd century was different than the 5th century. We understand different challenges occurred at different times. So that might also be a reason why stories deal with different things. So a lot of that is kind of speculative. Those are reasons why the story might change. It's very hard to ground the differences in those because we don't have such a firm grasp on the history. Unless the rabbi, say, is encountering a Zoroastrian priest. Then of course we know one of the problems they're dealing with is say, Zoroastrianism in Bavel. But we do understand that in general, these were different cultures, these were different times potentially, and that might result in differences between the stories. But really the first and the major factors that you want to look at is the story itself, the internal dynamic of the story, and then the context, the literary context, but also to a certain extent relationships to other stories in each Talmud, because many of the same problems will occur and are dealt with in multiple sources. A lot of these are just the challenges of human life, how one balances the study of Torah with domestic obligations. And so there are many stories about this, and you can look at each story in each Talmud in relation to other stories that deal with similar problems to try to understand common factors there.
Something I remember in the beginning, I think it's Avnei Machnai, where you mentioned how actually where the Agadah is located on the daf also makes a difference into how you're supposed to understand the story.
Yeah, that's one good example of it, because this is one of our most famous Agadot today. I actually don't even know if it was like most famous in the times of the Talmud. It's very hard to judge that. It's become very prominent today because it's such an interesting story about human authority, divine authority, interpretation, lo v'shamayim here, not in heaven. But in the Babylonian Talmud, that story occurs in Bava Metzia, and it's in the context of the laws of ona'ah, which is a kind of not insulting people, not causing them verbal harm. Ona'ah is like verbal aggression in a certain sense. And that seems to be the emphasis of the Agadah of that story in the Bavli. The rabbis humiliate Rabbi Eliezer and really come to pay a steep price for that. And one of the lessons that emerges from it, and from that context, which includes other traditions right there on the daf, about the importance of not humiliating other people, not insulting other people, not using your words, whether it's to your wife or whether it's to another human being, in those ways, is the importance of avoiding that kind of violence, verbal violence. But in the Yerushalmi, this story doesn't occur in Bava Metzia in that context. It occurs in Moed Katan. And in that tractate, it actually has to do in a section of Talmud that deals with the ban. Rabbis don't accept the majority or are recalcitrant in a certain way. Not just rabbis, if other people don't accept rabbinic authority, they can be put under under a ban by the community, kind of ostracized as a way to try to put pressure on them to bring them back in line. And the story in the Yerushalmi really is trying to communicate a message about that. and it goes in a very, very different direction. So that's a very good example where the context makes a big difference in interpretation. And if you don't pay attention to that literary context, it's easy to miss that. It's easy to miss out of that. And going back to our, even sort of touching on our first question, it seems like what's happened in this case is because we know the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, is earlier. It's edited earlier. It comes from an earlier period. The Babylonian Talmud went through a long editing process, really into the 5th, 6th, maybe the 7th century. So many of the stories in the Babylonian Talmud are later than those in the Jerusalem Talmud. It looks like the Babylonian Talmudic storytellers had a version of the story similar to that in the Yerushalmi, but they changed it. They added to it. They reoriented the focus of it because they were interested in a different problem, because they were grappling with a different issue. And this is one of, again, parts of the good evidence that the stories are didactic fiction. That is, they were reworked in a literary process to make them apply to different situations or different concerns of different storytellers. They're not two different people saw a biographical event and reported it differently. And that's why you have contradictions and tensions. So one story was reworked, was retold in different ways. It wasn't considered as, as historically accurate that you couldn't change it. It wasn't a kind of history. It was there to teach a lesson. And if you could teach a different lesson, or you wanted to teach a different lesson, a later storyteller felt free to rework these stories according to what was necessary for his time or for his audience. So the multiple contexts that you ask about is good evidence. It intersects with understanding the genre of the stories themselves as a kind of literature, didactic literature, fictional literature that can be reworked, retold, reoriented to, added to for different purposes by different storytellers.
Yeah, some of the reorientation that you're referring to, like I noticed, is that there would be, let's say in the Yerushalmi, the backdrop would be like a general location, but whereas in the Bavli, it would be the Beit Midrash. It would always tie everything to the Beit Midrash. So that's obviously for whatever reason, political reason, social reasons that they're doing that. I'd like you maybe to explain how that works. And also, like, obviously the demonology that was part of Babylonian culture is almost completely absent in the Yerushalmi tradition.
Yeah, so those are two great questions. So the first question is 100% right. Many of the stories that appear in the Yerushalmi where a location is not really given and it's not clear there's a setting, or if there is, it could be anywhere. Rabbis are talking to their students in the market or on the street, or occasionally it does mention a Beit Midrash. But Beit Midrash seems to be a small school. It's one rabbi and his disciples. It's sometimes what we call a disciple circle. You had one holy man or one rabbi, one teacher, not unlike a Hasidic and his disciples. In the Bavli, it's often set in what we think of as a yeshiva. Today, you have a large institution, lots and lots of students, multiple rabbis or teachers there, a hierarchy with a Rosh Yeshiva, a head of the academy, maybe some second in command, third in command. There's a kind of jockeying for positions. Who are the best students? They might have even sat in a kind of hierarchical order with the most advanced students toward the front. And rabbis competed. They competed in the Beit Midrash to know the most, to show their knowledge of Torah, to show their ability to think quickly, to engage in these dialectical debates, to respond to questions that were asked to them. So it seems like all of those motifs that occur mostly in the stories, or almost exclusively in the stories of the Babylonian Talmud, point us to something about late Babylonian culture. Now, this is one of the things that has unfortunately led to massive historical misunderstandings, because many of those stories are reworking of earlier stories about the Tanaim, about the early rabbis from the time of the Mishnah. So Rabbi Akiba and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and even Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabban Gamaliel, some of these early Tanaim from the 1st century, the 2nd century, in the stories in the Babylonian Talmud occur in these very highly developed, institutionalized yeshivas. And that led up many to misunderstand them and to think that these yeshivot already existed in the time of Hillel, in the time of Rabbi Akiva. But again, these are just the Babylonian storytellers reworking stories of their earlier sages in light of their reality in the 5th century, in the 6th century CE, where these yeshivot had developed, where rabbinic culture had flourished in that sense. So as far as we know, it's really only in the late stages of the Bavli, maybe toward the end of the Amoraic period, or even in the time of the Talmudic editors, the 400s, 500s, 600s, that these large-scale yeshivot developed, like we had in the Islamic era, like we have in Gaonic times, where we know that there was a very highly developed yeshiva culture. The early rabbis, Rabbi Akiva, the Tanaim, even all the rabbis of the Yerushalmi times, and the first generations in the Bavli did not function, did not learn, did not study in these large-scale yeshivot. It was a rabbinic culture, rabbinic learning, rabbinic pedagogy went on a much, much smaller scale. So you're absolutely right. Some of these most vivid stories about the rabbis in the yeshiva arguing with each other, sometimes being embarrassed, like Rabbi Eliezer was, jockeying for position and so on, having falling outs. Sometimes there's tensions between the rabbis and the Rosh Yeshiva. In a couple of the stories of Rabban Gamaliel, they even try to depose him. They try to replace him with varying degrees of success. All of those only occur in the Bavli, and it's from the very, very late strata of the Babylonian Talmud. So, here's a good example. We're understanding the stories in terms of literary texts, in terms of stories being reworked and comparing them to what their different emphases are, have really shed light on a historical development. It's not the history and the times of the characters. You're never really getting at the history at the time or the biography of the characters in the stories. You're understanding the history and the times of the storytellers. And those are much later rabbis, either in the land of Israel, who are putting together the Yerushalmi, or in Babylonia, the editors of the Babylonian Talmud. Occasionally, some of the sages of the Babylonian Talmud talked about their predecessors from centuries past.
In your